I have told this story only once before, to my youngest daughter, on the night before her wedding, when she asked me what love looked like in a man who had never learned its name. I told her it looked like the Duke of Ashmore standing very still in a crowded London drawing room, his voice the quietest in the room, and every soul present going silent as though the chandeliers had gone out. But I am getting ahead of myself. That is the end of it, and stories must begin where they begin. My name is Sir Prentice Mallow. I have been the Duke of Ashmore's closest friend for 31 years, since we were young men at the same school, and he was already the most silent boy in the form, watching everything with those dark, unsettling eyes as though he were cataloguing the world for later use. We were an unlikely pair, Ashmore and I, he with his inherited silences and his iron sense of order, I with my unfortunate tendency to speak before thinking and my equal tendency to find everything faintly amusing. He tolerated me because I never required him to perform warmth he did not feel. I valued him because he was the most honest man I knew. Those two facts, I think, are the whole of why we lasted. I should say a word about Ashmore Park before I say anything else, because the house is part of this story whether it knows it or not. It is a large house, very large, the kind of house that has been accumulating rooms and wings and purposes since the reign of the second George, and which therefore contains in its accumulated depths libraries that lead to other libraries and corridors that open onto courts that have no particular function except history. It is not a warm house. It was built by men who valued grandeur over comfort, and it remains, in most of its aspects, grand before all other things. The stone floors of the entrance hall are a particular shade of gray that, in winter, absorbs the cold and holds it. The high vaulted ceilings are beautiful and remote. The windows in the east wing face the park, and in the morning light they give the rooms a quality that is almost ecclesiastical. As though the house were engaged in some private devotion it does not share with its inhabitants. On a wet November morning, arriving through the park gates and seeing it at the end of the long approach, Ashmore Park has the quality of a statement, about permanence, about the weight of consequence, about what it means to have arrived at the place where the power lives. Emmeline Hartwell arrived at that house in a cold carriage on a morning in October with a single trunk and a hat box and her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at it through the carriage window with an expression I could not, from my position in the receiving party, quite read. It was not awe, it was not fear or not primarily. It was the expression, I came to think, of someone taking a very thorough measurement of a very large problem. I was present the day Lord Hartwell brought his daughter to Ashmore Park. I wish I could claim I perceived her immediately for what she was, which is to say, the most important thing that would ever happen to my friend. But I am a truthful man, and the truth is I did not. I saw a plain young woman in a gray traveling dress, standing in the entrance hall of one of the most imposing houses in England, with her hands folded, and her eyes moving carefully over the stone floors and the high vaulted ceiling as though she were trying to memorize it quickly, in case she were asked to leave. Lord Hartwell I had met before. He was a man of considerable surface and very little substance, the kind of man who had spent 40 years giving the impression of great wealth while slowly losing every last coin of it, and who had managed his ruination with the same air of authority he had managed everything else, so that even now, standing in another man's entrance hall to hand over his daughter as part of a financial settlement, he carried himself as though he were doing the Duke a favor. "Emmeline," he said without looking at her, "make your curtsy." She curtsied. She did it with a composure I found notable, given the circumstances. Ashmore received them in the library. He had chosen the library deliberately. This was not a drawing-room occasion, not in his view. A drawing-room implied hospitality. A library implied business. The terms had been negotiated through solicitors over the preceding weeks. Lord Hartwell's debts were considerable, spread across a half-dozen lenders, and the sum required to extinguish them was precisely the sum Ashmore had offered in exchange for the settlement. What the settlement entailed: the marriage of Miss Emmeline Hartwell to the Duke of Ashmore, to take place within 6 weeks. I had asked Ashmore, privately, why he had chosen to go about it this way. Why he had not simply found himself a bride through the ordinary channels, which would certainly have produced someone more obviously eligible. He had considered the question with his usual patience. "I require a wife who will manage Ashmore Park competently, produce an heir, and not expect me to pretend to feelings I am not certain I possess," he said at last. "Miss Hartwell is understood to be sensible, undemanding, and without inflated expectations. That is sufficient. She is also understood to be very plain, I said, because someone had to say it. I am not purchasing an ornament, he said, and returned to his correspondence. This, I had thought, was about the most romantic declaration the Duke of Ashmore would ever make. I had not, at that point, understood anything. In the library that afternoon, the papers were signed in a silence broken only by the scratch of pens and Lord Hartwell's occasional clearing of his throat, a noise I had come to associate with men who are uncomfortable and wish to disguise it as authority. Emmeline signed where she was directed to sign. She read each page first. I noticed this. Ashmore noticed this too. I could tell by the slight stilling of his attention when she turned the third page back and reread a clause and then signed. When the business was concluded, Lord Hartwell shook Ashmore's hand with the manner of a man completing a satisfactory transaction. He turned to his daughter. "You will be comfortable here," he said. The tone suggested this was meant as reassurance, but it landed as instruction. She smiled at him, a small, contained thing, and said she was sure she would. He kissed her on the forehead with the brief efficiency of a man who has remembered at the last moment that this is expected, and then he left. She stood for a moment after the sound of his carriage had faded, her hands still folded, her eyes on the window. Ashmore watched her. "The east wing has been prepared," he said. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, will show you your rooms. Dinner is at 8. If there is anything the rooms require, you need only tell her." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet, neither apologetic nor performing. It was simply the voice of a woman who said what she meant and no more. She followed Mrs. Calloway out of the library without another word, and Ashmore poured himself a glass of port and stood at the window and did not speak for a very long time. "Well," I said eventually. "Yes," he said, which was not a response, but it was all he offered. I stayed on at Ashmore Park for the next fortnight, which I justified to myself as friendship, and which was, in truth, pure curiosity. I wanted to see what happened when the most guarded man I knew lived at close quarters with a woman he had chosen entirely for her lack of inconvenience. What happened in those first days was almost nothing. They were civil at dinner, they spoke about the estate, they were not unkind to each other. They were two people observing a tacit agreement to occupy the same space without collision. She passed him the salt without being asked. He passed her the candle when her side of the table grew dim. It was not love. It was not even warmth, not yet. It was simply the careful arithmetic of two private people who have agreed to share a set of rooms and have decided that the sharing will go easier if neither of them demands more than courtesy requires. But even in those earliest days, beneath the careful arithmetic, I could see something that was not nothing. She was curious about the house. This sounds ordinary. It is not, when you consider that the house was hers in a sense and she had not chosen it, and she might very reasonably have received it as a fact to be endured rather than examined. She did not. I found her one morning in the long gallery, the formal portrait gallery on the second floor, which no one visited unless guided, standing before the oldest of the Ashmore family portraits with the attentive stillness of someone studying a document that might yield information if studied long enough. She was in the gallery alone. She had not asked for a guide and had not taken one. She had simply found her way there by whatever navigating instinct led her through the house's accumulated corridors, and she was working out from the portraits themselves who these people were and how they connected to the present. I did not interrupt her. I watched for a moment from the doorway, then moved on. But the image stayed with me, this quiet woman in her gray dress, in the gallery of the most powerful family in 3 counties, reading them as though they were an account she intended to understand before she was responsible for them. I found her there again, on 3 subsequent mornings. On the 4th morning, Ashmore found her there too. I know this because I passed the gallery that afternoon and saw both of them at the far end, standing before the second Duke's portrait, with Ashmore saying something quietly about the history of the entailment and Emmeline listening with her head tilted in the way she had when she was processing information she intended to use. They did not see me. I did not make myself seen. That evening, Ashmore mentioned at dinner that Emmeline had wished to understand the history of the estate, and that he had suggested she might read the family records, which were held in the estate room and could be made available if she wished. She said she would very much like that. He said he would have Drage prepare them. Neither of them acknowledged that this was, in any sense, a significant exchange. I acknowledged it privately and said nothing. She spent 4 mornings the following week in the estate room with the records. Drage reported this to me with the air of a man who is not surprised, and is also not quite hiding that he is pleased. Another morning I found her in the still room with Mrs. Calloway, asking questions about the household's winter preparations, the preserving, the drying, the laying in of stores. This was, by custom, entirely Mrs. Calloway's domain, and Mrs. Calloway was a woman who could receive encroachments on her domain with the graceful frigidity of Arctic weather. But she was not receiving this as an encroachment. She was answering the questions with the forthcoming pleasure of a woman who has been doing her work conscientiously for 20 years and has rarely been asked to explain how. Emmeline was listening with a pencil and a small notebook. Mrs. Calloway, I noticed, was smiling. There was also the matter of the household staff. Ashmore's people had served him for years with the particular loyalty that attaches itself to a difficult but fair employer. They knew what he required of them, which was competence and discretion, and they knew what he would never require, which was anything beyond that. They were, most of them, fond of him in the careful way of those who are fond of something they cannot be entirely certain will receive fondness well. They had learned not to ask after his health, not to wish him good morning if he was already reading, not to offer opinions unless directly solicited. They had also learned, over the years, the precise difference between the look he wore when something displeased him and the look he wore when something had merely not yet been addressed. A household learns these things because it must. They did not know what to make of Emmeline. She did not move among them in the manner they had been accustomed to, neither the grand and distant manner of a duchess who expects service as an abstraction, nor the over-friendly manner of someone who wishes to be liked. She moved among them as a person who regarded them as individuals she needed to understand in order to do her work correctly. She learned names. She asked Drage on her second morning for a list of everyone on the staff and their areas of responsibility, and she studied it. Within a week, she had stopped consulting the list. She asked questions, but they were not the vague, social questions of someone filling time. They were the questions of someone solving problems. When she spoke to the head cook about the kitchen arrangements, she was asking because the kitchen arrangements affected the quality of the household's provisioning, and she had seen, in the ledgers, that certain items were being ordered in quantities inconsistent with their use. When she walked the east corridor with the second footman to discuss the chimney smoke problem, she had already read the correspondence on the subject and formed a view about why previous repairs had failed. She was not performing interest. She was interested because she was a person who understood that running a household of this size was, in fact, a complex and consequential enterprise, and that the people who ran it with her deserved to be taken seriously. They noticed. Drage noticed first and said nothing, which was his way of expressing approval. Mrs. Calloway noticed second and was, I believe, quietly moved by it in a manner she would have denied vigorously if asked. The younger staff members noticed and were, if I am reading Drage's occasional reports correctly, fairly devoted to her within the month. Ashmore noticed none of this because he did not observe the household in the granular way Emmeline did. But he noticed the quality of it, the particular smoothness of a house in which the right things were done by people who understood why they were doing them. And one evening in November, about 3 weeks into Emmeline's residence, he remarked to me that he could not identify what had changed, but that something had. I told him the provisions were probably better managed. He said he supposed they must be. We did not discuss it further, but I noted that he looked satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with the provisions. Then small things began to change. The first thing I noticed was the household books. Ashmore's head steward, a solid and capable man named Drage, managed the day-to-day running of the estate with a competence that had never required improvement. 3 days after Emmeline's arrival, Drage appeared in the library with an expression I can only describe as mildly astonished and placed a set of ledgers on the desk. Her Grace has reviewed the household accounts, he said to Ashmore. She found a billing error in the provisioner's figures that has been running for approximately 2 years. The sum is not insignificant. Ashmore looked at the ledgers. How did she find it? She asked to see them, Drage said. There was a pause. She asked to see the household accounts, Ashmore said. On her second morning here, she said she preferred to understand what she was managing before she was managing it. Drage's expression retained its careful neutrality, but there was something in his eyes that looked very nearly like respect. She also had a number of suggestions regarding the winter storage arrangements that I have taken the liberty of implementing, as they were entirely sound. Ashmore said nothing. He looked at the ledger, then at Drage, then at the window. "Thank you, Drage," he said. Drage went out. Ashmore looked at the corrected figures for a moment, then closed the ledger and went back to his correspondence. I said nothing, but I filed it because I file everything. The second thing I noticed was the steward's wife. There was a family in the West Cottage, one of the smaller estate tenancies, whose patriarch, an old man named Wren, had died in the autumn. His wife was elderly and in uncertain health, and their son, who had worked on the Ashmore estate for 20 years, had been managing both his grief and his mother's care with a quiet stoicism that Ashmore respected and had tried to support practically, as was his way, by seeing to it that the cottage rent was waived and that provisions were sent weekly. He was not a man who knew how to offer comfort in any more human form than this. Emmeline, it seemed, was. I came upon her one morning in the West Cottage garden. She was sitting with old Mrs. Wren on a bench in the pale winter sunshine, and they were talking about nothing in particular, about the old woman's garden in spring, about a particular rose she had tended for 30 years, about her husband's favorite meal. Emmeline was listening with the total, unhurried attention of someone for whom this was the most important conversation in the world. She was not being a duchess. She was not conferring a condescension. She was simply there in the garden, in the cold morning light, and old Mrs. Wren was talking about her roses and her husband's favorite meal, as though she had been holding it all waiting for someone to ask. She did not hear me approach. I stood for a moment at the garden gate and watched, and I felt something shift quietly in my understanding of who she was. I mentioned it to Ashmore that evening. Not pointedly. I know better than to be pointed with him. I mentioned it the way I mention most things to him, sideways, in the course of a general observation. "Your tenant's wife seems in better spirits," I said. "Drage told me," he said. He was reading a letter, and he did not look up, but I noticed that he did not turn the page. "Your wife sat with her for 2 hours this morning." So Drage said. He set the letter down, he picked up his glass. He said after a moment, "She did not mention it to me." "No," I said, "I don't imagine she thought it required mentioning." He was quiet for a long time after that. The third thing I noticed was the library. Ashmore's library was his great pride, 3,000 volumes, organized by his own system, which no one else had ever mastered. He was, in matters of the library, somewhat territorial. In 30 years of friendship, I had learned not to remove volumes without asking, and never to replace them in the wrong place. The library was not exactly forbidden to others. He would have said, if asked, that he was delighted for anyone to use it. But the delighted anyone was understood to include almost no one, and the almost was important. I passed the library on my way to bed one night, some 10 days into my stay, and found the door ajar and the lamp lit. Ashmore was not in the habit of leaving lamps burning. I looked in. Emmeline was at the far end of the room, standing at the shelves with a book open in her hands, her back to the door, reading by the lamp with the stillness of someone who has been reading for a long time and has entirely forgotten the rest of the world. She had let her hair down. She had not, I think, expected anyone to pass. It fell to her shoulders in a way that changed the quality of her face, softened something about it. She was not aware of me. She turned a page with the deliberate care of a person who treats books as objects worth treating with care, and I noticed the title on the spine, one of the natural philosophy volumes from the upper shelves, which were not the books that casual borrowers found. I backed away from the door without making a sound. The next morning at breakfast, Ashmore looked across the table at his wife and said, without preamble, "The organizational system in the third bay of the north wall is my own. It is not immediately intuitive. If you would like me to explain it, I am willing." She looked up from her toast. Her expression was entirely composed. "That would be very helpful," she said. "I could not determine the logic last night, and I did not wish to displace anything before I understood it." "It is organized by subject first, then date of acquisition," he said. "The subject categories are printed in a small notebook in the top drawer of the writing table. You are welcome to use it." "Thank you," she said. "There is also a third collection in the lower gallery that Drage may not have shown you. If you are interested in natural philosophy, it is worth an afternoon." She looked at him for a moment, just a moment, and I saw something pass across her face that I could not quite name. "I am interested in natural philosophy," she said. "Then I will show you," he said, and returned to his eggs. I left for London the following day, as I had already stayed 2 weeks past my planned departure. But I took with me an impression that stayed with me for months, the image of Ashmore at the breakfast table, suggesting the lower gallery to his wife with the careful air of a man offering a great gift and not quite knowing how to frame it as such. The wedding took place 6 weeks after the signing, as agreed. It was a quiet affair, a private ceremony at the chapel of Ashmore Park, attended by the household, myself, and a handful of Ashmore's neighbors who constituted, effectively, his entire social world. There was no one from Emmeline's side except a cousin of her father's, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Alderton, who wept happily at the front pew and pressed Emmeline's hand before the service began. She had the look of a woman who had worried about Emmeline for a long time and was relieved, not that the marriage was grand, but that the house was solid and the man looked as though he meant what he said. Lord Hartwell did not attend. He had written to say that his health did not permit the journey. Ashmore told me this with his customary absence of expression, and I had the sense that if he had any feelings about the insult, he had filed them away in the category of things that were Lord Hartwell's problem and not his. Emmeline wore a gown the color of old ivory, simply cut with pearl buttons. She had a small spray of winter roses pinned at her waist, which Mrs. Alderton had apparently provided with great satisfaction. She walked to the front of the chapel at a composed and unhurried pace, and when she stood at Ashmore's side, she was the same still, contained person she always was, except that her hands, I noticed, were not folded. They were at her sides open. It was a very small thing, and I thought about it for a long time afterward. After the ceremony, she moved through Ashmore Park as though it were something she had agreed to take responsibility for and intended to take seriously, which I came to understand was precisely how she viewed it. She did not redecorate or impose or make declarations. She learned the names of every person on the estate, from Drage to the youngest stable boy. She understood the drainage problem in the East Field before Ashmore had finished explaining it, and proposed a solution he implemented within the month. She corresponded with the vicar about the condition of the schoolroom in the village, and arranged for the repair without troubling Ashmore with the detail until it was done, at which point she reported it briefly and accurately, and moved on. She was, in short, everything she had been said to be, sensible, undemanding, without inflated expectations. And she was also, increasingly, something she had not been described as, because no one who had described her had paid sufficient attention. She was remarkable. I spent a great deal of time at Ashmore Park that winter. I had my own estate in the next county, but I am a sociable man and my estate does not especially require me, whereas Ashmore Park had become, for the first time in the years I had known it, genuinely interesting. I told myself I was there to keep Ashmore company. This was only partly true. I watched him that winter. It is what friends do when they believe something important is happening and do not wish to be wrong about it. He was not a changed man. Nothing about Ashmore happened quickly or with announcement. He was the same silent, precise, unsentimental person he had always been. But there were small revisions in him that I catalogued with the care of a man who knew the original very well. He began to come to dinner earlier, not dramatically, 5 minutes, sometimes 10, but Ashmore was a man who arrived at the appointed hour to the minute, and the slight earliness was perceptible to someone who had been watching for 30 years. I eventually understood that he was arriving in time to hear whatever Emmeline had been saying to Drage or Mrs. Calloway in the minutes before dinner, which was typically something precise and interesting about the estate, or a report on some problem she had quietly resolved. He did not announce that this was what he was doing. He arrived, found the conversation already in progress, and inserted himself into it with an air of having merely happened by. No one, least of all Emmeline, appeared to notice. I noticed. I catalogued it. He began to recommend books. He had never recommended books to me. I was not sufficiently systematic a reader, and he knew it. But I passed the library one afternoon and heard him inside it, and then her voice answering, and I stood in the corridor for several minutes listening to a conversation about agricultural philosophy and Roman land reform that was, by any measure, more intellectually substantial than anything I had managed with him in 30 years. He had opinions. She had countering opinions offered with perfect composure and not the slightest apology. He pushed back. She held her ground. There was a long silence, and then he said something I did not catch, and she laughed, a real, sudden laugh, unguarded, the kind she did not produce in company, and he said it again, and she laughed again, and I walked away down the corridor because I had understood something. He was happy. Not obviously happy, not in any fashion he could have been challenged on. But I knew his face in all its arrangements, and there was one I had never seen before, a quality of attention when she was in the room, focused and held and unwilling to leave. That was so entirely at variance with his customary cool assessment of the world that it could only be one thing, and the thing it was had taken him completely by surprise. He had not expected this. I think, if I am honest, he had not believed it was possible for him. He was a man who had spent 40 years in the comfortable certainty that he was not the kind of person to whom love happened, and the certainty had been so long established that it had become a kind of refuge. He had arranged his life accordingly. He had chosen a wife accordingly, chosen her precisely because she seemed to ask nothing of his emotional reserves, which he had assumed were thin. He had been wrong about his reserves, as it turned out. They were simply untested. In January, he invited her to ride with him across the North Fields to assess the fencing. This was not unusual in practical terms. She had by then a clear understanding of the whole estate, and her opinion on it was valuable. But it was the first time he had invited her to ride with him for no purpose that required her presence, which was what it was, though he would not have said so. I watched them go from the library window. They were out for 3 hours. When they came back, they were talking, not the careful, practical speech of the dinner table, but a different kind of talking, the kind with no clear purpose, except that they had things to say to each other. I could hear the sound of it from the window without making out the words, and it was, in its cadence, the conversation of people who have discovered that the other person is unexpectedly worth talking to. Emmeline dismounted first. She was a confident writer. I had not known this, and I suspected neither had Ashmore. She swung down with an ease that suggested she had grown up writing, which no one had thought to mention to either of them. Ashmore dismounted beside her, and for a moment they stood in the stable yard, their horses handed off to the grooms, and he said something to her in a low voice. She looked up at him. She was a good deal shorter than he was, and the angle put her face in sharp profile against the gray January sky, and she said something back. He nodded. Then they walked in together through the side door, and I went back to my book. It was not the last time they rode together. It became a habit, in the way that habits between two people develop when neither of them remarks on it, gradually by accretion until the thing is simply part of the day. He rode, she rode, they went the same direction. By February it was unremarkable, which meant that it had by then become necessary, which is a different kind of unremarkable entirely. I noticed other things in those weeks. The way he refilled her glass at dinner before she reached for it. The way she set the lamp at the end of the library table nearest his customary chair, though her own chair was further away, because she had noticed, with the attentiveness she brought to everything, that the angle of his usual lamp gave insufficient light for the maps he reviewed at night. The way he began, gradually, to read aloud to her from the books he had recommended, not because she required being read to, but because they had discovered that this was an efficient way to disagree about things, and they both, it turned out, enjoyed disagreeing about things in the particular fashion of people who are very well matched intellectually and know it. It was, by any measure, a peculiar courtship, conducted entirely after the fact of a marriage that had begun as a transaction. But then Ashmore had always done things in the wrong order. There were evenings in that deep midwinter, when the three of us sat in the drawing-room after dinner, Ashmore with his papers, Emmeline with her correspondence, I with whatever book I had most recently borrowed from the library's third bay, and the quiet of the house settled around us with the quality of something deliberately chosen rather than merely endured. The fire was good. The candles were sufficient. Outside, the park lay under frost, the old trees skeletal and still, and inside there was this, a room in which three people had ceased to require anything of each other except their company, and found it enough. I had spent evenings in that drawing-room for 20 years. I had never found it like that before. I noticed other things in those weeks. The way he refilled her glass at dinner before she reached for it. The way she set the lamp at the end of the library table nearest his customary chair, though her own chair was further away, because she had noticed, with the attentiveness she brought to everything, that the angle of his usual lamp gave insufficient light for the maps he reviewed at night. The way he began, gradually, to read aloud to her from the books he had recommended, not because she required being read to, but because they had discovered that this was an efficient way to disagree about things. And they both, it turned out, enjoyed disagreeing about things in the particular fashion of people who are very well matched intellectually and know it. It was, by any measure, a peculiar courtship, conducted entirely after the fact of a marriage that had begun as a transaction. But then Ashmore had always done things in the wrong order. I should note that I was not, through all of this, entirely a passive observer. I was Ashmore's closest friend, and I was aware that he was a man constitutionally incapable of articulating what was happening to him, and that if it went unexamined for too long, he was capable of filing it in the wrong category and leaving it there indefinitely. So occasionally, with great care, I said things. I said things such as, "Emmeline was telling me about the Roman drainage systems at dinner. She's read more on the subject than any woman I've ever met." Or, "She handled that business with the Wren family with remarkable instinct. You're fortunate she came with it." Or once, most directly, "She's not what anyone expected, is she?" He always replied to these observations with the minimal possible engagement. But I noticed that he did reply, which he would not have done if the subject bored him. In February, I witnessed the moment I believe was the hinge of the whole thing, though I doubt Ashmore would name it that. I believe he would say it was simply a Tuesday afternoon. There had been a problem in the south barn, a structural concern Ashmore had been monitoring, and it had resolved itself into something requiring immediate attention and a significant decision about whether to rebuild or repair. Ashmore had the plans spread on the library table and was reviewing them with his land agent, a thorough man named Croft, when Emmeline came into the room. She read the situation at a glance. She did not offer her opinion or interrupt. She took a chair at the far end of the table from which she could see the plans and sat quietly. Croft presented his assessment. Ashmore asked 2 questions. Croft answered. They were proceeding toward a decision, the repair option, which was the less expensive and, in Croft's view, the more prudent, when Emmeline said, quite simply, from the far end of the table, "The repair will hold for 3 years, perhaps 4. The soil movement in that corner has been continuous for at least 5 winters if the records are accurate. Rebuilding costs more now and nothing in 8 years." There was a pause. Croft looked at her. He was not, in my experience, a man of great adaptability, but he had by then absorbed the reality of the new Duchess and responded to it with cautious respect. "Her Grace has a point," he said to Ashmore. Ashmore had been looking at the plans. He looked up, across the length of the table, at his wife. She met his eyes with the same steady composure with which she met everything. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "Check the records for the last 10 winters and confirm it." "I already have," she said. "It is in the folder under the green ribbon, 2nd shelf." She indicated the shelves with a gesture. "I prepared it last week when Croft first raised the concern in case it was useful." Croft retrieved the folder. He opened it. He read for a moment. He said to Ashmore, "She's right." Ashmore was still looking at his wife. Emmeline met his gaze for a moment longer, then returned to the letter she had been writing. "They rebuilt the barn." But that was not the moment. The moment was that evening at dinner, when Ashmore put down his fork and said, without preface, "You prepared that folder before you knew I would need it." "Yes," she said. "How long have you been doing that, preparing things ahead of when they're needed?" She considered the question with the seriousness she gave all questions. "Since I was 12, she said. "My father's estate was not well managed. I had no authority over it, but I could at least understand it. It seemed the least I could do." He was quiet. Then, "What did your father think of that?" She was quiet for a moment in return. "He found it tiresome," she said. "He preferred things to be simple." Something shifted in Ashmore's face. It was not visible as an expression, exactly. He was not a man whose face did visible things. But I had 30 years of reading him, and what I read was a man reassigning something fundamental, a recalibration of how the world was organized and what his place in it had been. "I do not find it tiresome," he said, and then, because he was Ashmore, "I find it useful." She accepted this with a brief, real smile. It was, I understood, the precise form of compliment she would have valued most, from him especially. Spring came, London came with it. It was, by long custom, the season of obligations. The assemblies and dinners and routs and presentations that Ashmore attended with the minimum required engagement, and departed from at the earliest defensible moment. He had done so for 20 years as a bachelor with no one to explain the departure to. Now he did so as a married man, with Emmeline at his side, and I observed with interest how the situation altered. She was not comfortable in these gatherings. I say this not as a criticism, neither was Ashmore, and I had always liked him for it. But where his discomfort was rendered invisible by rank and the particular armor of his bearing, hers was briefly visible in the slight hesitation at doorways, the way she scanned a room on entering, the moment of settling herself that passed in a second and left no trace. She was perfectly composed thereafter. She knew how to move through society, how to speak and to whom and in what register. She had been raised in it, even if she had moved through it unremarked. The society, for its part, did not quite know what to make of her. The Duchess of Ashmore was known to be the former Miss Hartwell, who had been arranged into the marriage for reasons the politely curious understood and the impolitely curious made no secret of discussing. She was acknowledged to be plain. She had no notable connections. She had no fortune of her own. She was not witty in the performative fashion the London rooms rewarded, and she was not beautiful, and she did not seem especially dazzled by the grandeur around her, which the London rooms also rewarded. In their way, the gaping admiration of the provincial newcomer is always welcome. She was simply herself, intelligent and quiet and measured. She spoke when she had something to say and otherwise did not. She listened to people with the same full attention she had given old Mrs. Wren in the cottage garden, which had the effect of making certain people very comfortable, and others faintly unnerved. The comfortable people were the ones who were accustomed to being actually heard. The unnerved ones were the ones who were accustomed to performing, and had never had a mirror that reflected with perfect clarity. I observed Ashmore observing her, across rooms at intervals. He was not subtle about it, which was in itself remarkable because Ashmore was subtle about everything. He did not stare, nothing as undignified as that, but there was a quality of orientation, a consistent angling of his attention toward wherever she was in the room, that reminded me of something I could not name for several days. Then I remembered. It reminded me of the way he was with the plans of Ashmore Park spread on the library table, that careful, total engagement with something he found genuinely important. He had turned that quality of attention on his wife, and it was clear he was not aware he had done so. He was also, I noticed, considerably less interested in leaving these gatherings than he had been in previous years. This was a fact so peculiar for those who knew him that I began testing it deliberately, suggesting our departure at intervals earlier than his customary exit time and watching him decline. He always had a reason: there was someone he meant to speak to, or the supper had not yet been served, or the evening was still early. These were not untrue reasons. They were also, I was fairly sure, not the actual reason. The actual reason was across the room, in conversation with someone she had apparently set at their ease, turning slightly so that the lamp caught the plain ivory profile of her face. There was one particular evening in late May that I remember with clarity, because it was the first occasion on which I saw someone mistake Emmeline Hartwell for someone they ought to be attending to, and then realize, in the course of a single conversation, that they had been right to think so without knowing why. It was Lady Forsyth's musicale, one of those London evenings organized around a performance of sufficient distinction to draw the serious and the fashionable in roughly equal measure. I was standing near the back of the room with Ashmore, both of us having executed the usual social maneuvers, when I noticed Lord Aldam's eldest son, a young man of 22 who considered himself a great judge of everything, and had recently acquired the opinion that he was also something of an agricultural reformer, making his way toward Emmeline with the air of someone who intends to be charming to an unimportant woman and receive gratitude for it. I could not hear the opening of the conversation from where I stood, but I could see Emmeline's face, composed, attentive, entirely pleasant, and I could see the young man's face, and I watched with quiet amusement as his expression passed through several stages in rapid succession. Confident opening, the slight surprise of a more specific response than he had expected, the recovery and renewed offensive, a pause, a longer pause, and then the expression of a man who has just understood that he is arguing about a subject he knows less well than the woman he was proposing to inform. Emmeline said something, he said something, she said something further, he was quiet. After a moment he laughed, not the laugh of condescension, but the genuine laugh of someone who has been caught out and finds it, on reflection, acceptable. He said something that I later learned was an acknowledgement that her point about drainage and root systems was entirely correct, and that he had clearly been reading the wrong people on the subject. She recommended 2 books. He wrote them down. Ashmore, who had been watching this exchange from beside me, said nothing at all. But I noticed that when the young Oldham excused himself and went to find the book's titles more precisely recalled, Ashmore's posture had altered very slightly, something in the set of his shoulders, a quality of satisfaction that he would not have described as pride, but which was unmistakably pride. Lord Hartwell appeared at one of these evenings in March. I had been aware that he was in London. He had sent a brief note to Ashmore acknowledging the occasion of the marriage and expressing, in the formulaic language of a man who did not wish to be thought deficient, his satisfaction at the arrangement. Ashmore had replied with equal formality, and they had not spoken since. Lord Hartwell had chosen, as he typically chose, the path of least awkwardness, which was in this case to maintain a polite distance and not require either party to feel anything about the other. He appeared at Lady Forsyth's assembly on an evening in late March. I was present, Ashmore was present, Emmeline was present, and greeted his son-in-law with the hearty good cheer of a man who has been relieved of a considerable problem and is grateful for it in the way that does not require acknowledgement. He shook Ashmore's hand. He kissed his daughter on the cheek. "You look well," he said to Emmeline. This was a surprised assessment, delivered in the tone of a man who had not particularly expected it. She did look well, as it happened. She had been at Ashmore Park for nearly 4 months, and there was something different in her bearing that I had been observing for weeks, a kind of settling into herself, a solidity that had perhaps always been there but had not previously had the room to be visible. She was the same plainly dressed, quietly composed woman she had always been, but she stood differently. "Thank you, father," she said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. He moved on after a few minutes, absorbed back into the room, and I watched Emmeline watch him go. It was an opaque moment. I could not read her face with any confidence. She had a complicated history with a man who had never quite seen her, and what she felt about him, whether it was sorrow or relief or something more complex. She kept, as she kept everything, in that careful interior space to which no one had been given the whole key. Then she turned back to the room, and her composure was perfect, and she was present for the rest of the evening with the good-natured patience of someone who has made her peace with the performance required of her. Ashmore had watched the brief exchange from across the room. When Lord Hartwell had moved away, he crossed to his wife's side. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her, and she very slightly, almost imperceptibly, moved an inch closer to him, and I do not think she knew she had done it. He noticed. I could tell by the almost invisible stilling of him. They stayed like that for some time. In April, something happened that I have been reluctant to write down, because it seems small when written and was, in fact, the largest thing. We were at Ashmore Park for the Easter fortnight. It had been a wet spring, and the East Field, that perpetual concern, had required a further inspection, and Ashmore and Emmeline had ridden out together for the 3rd time that week. They rode together most mornings now, which Ashmore had not mentioned to me, and I had not mentioned to him, on the unspoken understanding that mentioning it would require him to categorize it, and categorizing it before he was ready would make him do something defensive with it. So we did not mention it, and he rode with her, and she rode with him, and the mornings they were out were noticeably the mornings on which Ashmore came to lunch in a better humor. They had come in from the East Field, and Emmeline had gone upstairs, and Ashmore and I were in the library with a decanter and the plans. This was our customary arrangement when Emmeline was occupied elsewhere, and Ashmore said, with no particular emphasis and without looking at me, "I made an error in the original assessment." "The barn," I said. "You rebuilt it." "Not the barn," he said. He turned his glass in his hand. "I chose her," he said, "because I believed she would require nothing of me." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "She requires everything," he said. "She requires everything I thought I did not possess." He paused. "I find that I possess it." I said nothing, because there was nothing to say to that. He sat with his glass for a while, then he said, "I do not know how to tell her." "You could begin," I suggested carefully, "by telling her." He gave me the look he reserved for my more obvious observations. I gave him the look I reserved for his more unnecessary silences. "It is not," he said after a moment, "the kind of thing I am accustomed to saying." "No," I agreed. but I think she is the kind of person who would appreciate it being said simply, without architecture." He thought about this for what felt like a long time. Then he stood up, set down his glass, and left the library. I did not hear what he said to her. I was not meant to. But I know they were in the garden for a very long time that evening, and when they came in to dinner, there was something about both of them that was different, not in any external way, not in the way they spoke or the way they sat, but in the quality of the space between them, which had been, until that evening, a space of careful coexistence, and was now something else entirely. She looked at him differently after that. There was a quality in the look that was, I can only call it permission, a granting of something that had been withheld not for calculation, but for self-protection, the opening of a space that had been closed for a long time. He looked at her with the same unhurried intensity he had been looking at her for months, except that now he no longer looked away when she might notice. They were not, to the external observer, a dramatically romantic couple. They did not display. They did not perform. They were the same two people at the dinner table, him precise and spare, her composed and measured, except that they were now unmistakably a pair in the way that certain people are pairs, where the space between them has been staked and held and will not be relinquished. The household noticed without comment. Drage had the satisfaction of a man who has watched something resolve correctly. Mrs. Calloway was briefly moved, which she concealed with admirable efficiency. The stable boy who managed their morning horses told the cook, who told Mrs. Calloway, who told no one else, but who arrived at dinner with an expression of quiet, private gladness that persisted for several days. I was purely happy. It is perhaps worth saying at this point what Emmeline was not. She was not transformed. She did not become something other than herself under the influence of being loved. She did not bloom, in the manner of fiction, into a swan of sudden beauty or sudden wit or sudden social confidence. She remained plainly dressed and quietly spoken and more interested in the drainage of the East Field than in the opinion of Lady Forsyth's drawing-room. She was, in short, exactly who she had always been, the full, complex, capable, quietly extraordinary person she had been before anyone had recognized it as such. What changed was that she knew she was seen. I think this was, for her, the most important thing that had ever happened. Not the marriage, not the estate, not the rank. None of these meant what it meant to be known, specifically and completely, by someone whose seeing she trusted. She had lived for 24 years in a world that had looked at her and understood nothing, and now there was one person who had looked at her and understood everything, and this had not made her soft or dependent or in any way lesser than she was. It had made her more thoroughly herself. She was that spring the best version of Emmeline Hartwell that had ever existed, or rather, not the best version, simply Emmeline Hartwell, undiluted at last. She moved through the rooms of Ashmore Park with the ease of a person who has found the place they belong. She argued with Croft on the drainage question and was proved right again. She began a correspondence with a botanical society about the kitchen garden's south wall. She rode every morning. She read in the library until the lamps burned low. She sat with old Mrs. Wren until the roses came back in the West Cottage garden, and then she sat with her in the garden among the roses, and wrote back to everyone who wrote to her, and managed everything she was given to manage, and asked for nothing she was not given freely. I should say, for completeness, that I had by then a very clear understanding of why this woman had been called undemanding for 24 years, and it had nothing to do with an absence of capacity for demand. She had simply learned, very young, that demands made of the wrong people in the wrong circumstances produce nothing except the sensation of having asked. So she had stopped asking of those who would not give, and had instead developed the habit of providing for herself whatever she required, quietly and without comment, and had found that this was, in its way, a kind of freedom, the freedom of someone who has ceased to rely on the world's notice, and has therefore ceased to be diminished by its inattention. What she had never had, until Ashmore, was someone whose notice she found worth relying on. He was worth it in all the ways that mattered, not because he was a duke, which was an accident of birth that meant nothing to her except as a set of practical circumstances, but because he was honest with her. Because when he said he found something useful, he meant it, and when he said he did not find something tiresome, he had already considered whether it was and concluded that it was not. Because he was the same person in the drawing-room that he was in the library and the stable yard, and the estate-room with Croft, and the garden with old Mrs. Wren's son. The same measured, undeceiving, inconveniently principled man, all the way through, and she had understood this about him before most people who had known him for decades had. I loved her for it in the brotherly fashion appropriate to a man of my position. I also loved Ashmore rather more than I had before for having had the sense to see it. He was, on the evidence, a better man than I had given him credit for. I had credited him highly. In June, they returned to London for the summer season. It was the first season they attended as an established couple, rather than a recent and slightly unusual marriage, and the social world had had time to adjust its assessments. Society is always willing to revise its opinion of a woman whose husband's esteem for her is visible, because whatever else society says about itself, it takes its cues from the people with power. Ashmore's esteem for his wife was, by June, clearly visible to anyone who watched carefully. He was not effusive. He was constitutionally incapable of effusion. But he had a way of angling himself in any room that placed him within easy reach of her, and a way of introducing her in conversation that made his respect for her intelligence quietly, unmistakably apparent. People who met them that season came away with the impression of a couple who were very well matched, in a way that redrew what well-matched meant. Emmeline accepted this recalibration with the same composure she accepted everything. She was not altered by the improved social opinion. She was not warmed by it, nor was she cold to it. It was simply a fact, like the soil movement in the South Corner, to be noted and managed accordingly. Lord Hartwell arrived in London in late June. He had been in the country through the spring, his health, he said, but Lord Hartwell's health had always been a flexible concept that expanded and contracted with his social convenience. He appeared at several of the same gatherings we attended, and he was, in his way, proud of his son-in-law's standing and not entirely immune to the reflected consequence of the connection, which I observed with the mild contempt it deserved. He spoke of Emmeline to his acquaintances in the way he had always spoken of her, briefly, without particular attention, as one speaks of a settled fact that requires no further consideration. Yes, Emmeline married Ashmore, all very well was the gist of it, and the manner was the manner of a man for whom the matter had been resolved and filed. She had been a problem. She was no longer a problem. The file was closed. He did not ask after the East Field. He did not ask after old Mrs. Wren. He did not ask what she was reading, or what she had done about the South Barn, or whether she had found the lower gallery. He had never asked any of these things, and he did not begin now. I watched Emmeline in these settings when her father spoke of her in this fashion, and she was within earshot. She was always entirely composed. She had had 24 years of practice. She knew, I think, that the file had been closed from the moment of her birth, and she had ceased to expect it to be reopened. What I could not determine was whether this had ceased to grieve her. The evening I am leading toward arrived in the first week of July. It was the largest gathering of the season, the Arborfield Assembly, held annually at the Arborfield Town House in Grosvenor Square, which was the great social summit of the summer in those years, and was attended by every person of consequence who happened to be in London. There were upward of 300 people. Every chandelier in the house was lit. The noise was considerable. The supper was, as was traditional at the Arborfield Assembly, very good. I was with Ashmore and Emmeline in one of the smaller reception rooms that adjoined the main assembly. We had withdrawn for a moment's quiet. Ashmore's tolerance for large gatherings had not expanded dramatically, even love's improvements having their limits, and we were talking about nothing, in the comfortable way of people who have been in each other's company long enough to make silence optional. Emmeline had a glass of lemonade. Ashmore was watching the room with his customary air of mild detachment. I was telling them both something inconsequential about a wager that had been made at my club, which Emmeline found amusing and Ashmore found characteristic. Lord Hartwell was across the room, among a group of acquaintances, which included Sir Francis Aldham, whose opinion of himself was the highest in the county, and Lady Carterton, who collected other people's social currency with the dedication of a career. It was not an unusual grouping. They were talking, in the animated fashion of people who have already had several glasses of something better than lemonade, and they were at the volume that passes in a loud room for private. I caught fragments, not because I was listening deliberately, I was not at first, but because Ashmore had gone still beside me, which was always a signal. Lord Hartwell said, No, Emmeline was never any trouble, not in that sense. Very biddable girl, never any particular expectations. Suited Ashmore, I should think. A man who doesn't want fuss. She's an acceptable arrangement, no more than that. just the sort of sensible thing that gets done without anyone's emotions becoming. He did not finish the sentence. He may have gone on. The assembly was noisy and I lost the thread. But I had heard enough, and so had Ashmore. I want to be precise about what happened next, because I have replayed it many times, and it is important to describe it exactly. Ashmore did not raise his voice. He did not move toward his father-in-law quickly or with any sign of agitation. He was, from the outside, entirely composed. He set down his glass with the deliberate, quiet precision of a man who is attending very carefully to his own movements, and he crossed the room at his customary pace, which was neither hurried nor slow. He was simply moving, as he always moved, with the assurance of a man who assumes the room will adjust to him, and the room always does. He stopped at the edge of the group. Sir Francis Aldem noticed him first, and his expression shifted in the manner of a man who has just realized someone very important has arrived in the circle. Lady Carterton's eyes went bright. She was always an antenna for social weather. Lord Hartwell turned last. "Ashmore," Lord Hartwell said, with the heartiness of a man who has nothing on his conscience because he has not been paying close enough attention to know that he should. "Come and join." "I will say something," Ashmore said, in a voice that was completely level, completely quiet, and that had the precise quality of attention in it that I had been cataloging for months, the quality he reserved for things he found genuinely important. "I should like you to hear it clearly, so I will say it once." The group was very still. The noise of the assembly continued around them, oblivious, but in that small circle there was the particular silence of people who understand that something is happening. "My wife," said Ashmore, "is not an arrangement. She is not acceptable, in the sense you mean, adequate, tolerable, serviceable. She is, in every way that matters and in several that I did not know existed when I was fortunate enough to marry her, the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life. She manages an estate of 1,200 acres with a precision and an intelligence I have not witnessed in 30 years of working with men who are paid to do exactly that. She is kind in the manner that requires something real, not the manner that requires only a good performance. She reads more widely and thinks more carefully than anyone I know. She has never, in my experience, been anything other than exactly who she is, regardless of what it cost her, and I know of no more rigorous standard for a person's worth." He paused for a moment. The pause was exact and unhurried, the pause of a man who has not finished. "If the arrangement you speak of was a convenience, the inconvenience of discovering what it was an arrangement with has been the greatest gift I have received. I wanted you to know that. I am aware you find her undemanding. I would suggest that what you have taken for an absence of demands is, in fact, an abundance of dignity. You will perhaps see the difference more clearly now." He did not wait for a response. He turned with the same even unhurried pace and walked back across the room to his wife. I watched Lord Hartwell. I want to record what his face did because it seems important. At first he looked as though he had been struck in the way that men of his sort look when they are struck, briefly naked, the surface washed away, the thing underneath visible. Then the surface reassembled itself, as it always does in men of his sort. He said something to Sir Francis Aldem, I could not hear what, and the group made the sounds of people reconfiguring around a difficult moment, and then the assembly noise swallowed them again. I turned back to Ashmore. He had reached Emmeline. She had been watching from across the room. She could not have missed it. She had been standing in a line of sight, and when he came to stand beside her again, she looked at him with that look she had had since April, the one that was not gratitude and was not performance, and was simply the complete, unreserved look of a person who has been fully seen and is fully seeing in return. He did not explain. He did not, as some men might have, make the moment about his own feeling by speaking of it or offering any gesture that would have required her acknowledgement. He simply came back to stand beside her, as he had been standing beside her all evening, close enough that the space between them was staked and held and would not be relinquished. She turned back to the room. After a moment she said, quietly, "The third movement was particularly effective." He glanced at her. "The what?" "Your remarks," she said. "You built them in 3 movements. It is what you do when you want something to be inarguable." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, because Ashmore's face did not smile in the ordinary fashion, but the quality of expression that functioned in him as one. "You were counting the movements," he said. "I was listening," she said. "It is what I do." He made a sound. I had never heard him make it before. It was low and involuntary and almost entirely suppressed, which was exactly the fashion in which the Duke of Ashmore would laugh. She looked up at him. There was that look again, warm and direct and without apology, and there was, in return, the look he had developed over the past months for her specifically. The one I could not adequately describe except to say that it was the look of a man who had discovered he was wealthy in a currency he had not known existed. They stood like that for a moment. Then she offered him her glass. "Would you like some of my lemonade?" she said. "It is better than it looks." He took it, he tasted it. "It is," he agreed. "I had suspected the Arborfield cook," she said, "might extend to something better than the usual." "She has," he confirmed, and handed the glass back. And they drifted back into the assembly room together, and the evening continued around them. I stood where I was for a moment, holding my own glass, and tried to think whether I had, in 31 years of knowing the Duke of Ashmore, ever seen him share someone's lemonade. I had not. I left the Arborfield assembly rather early. I had, by that point, everything I had come for. In the carriage, I wrote 3 sentences in a small notebook I kept for the purpose of recording things I did not wish to lose. The sentences were: "He said, the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life." She listened, she counted the movements. Neither of them has since required anything from me by way of explanation. I think those 3 sentences contain the whole of the story, but I have told it at greater length for my daughter's benefit, and because stories of this kind deserve to be told fully, once, so that they are not flattened into something simpler than they were. Lord Hartwell was quiet for the remainder of the season. He did not, I believe, find a way to address what had happened. It was not in his nature to address things that required him to acknowledge a failure of perception. He moved in the same circles, said the same things, and by August had recovered the air of a man who has not been publicly corrected and is fairly certain of it. He was wrong, of course. He had been publicly corrected. But his was a particular variety of self-assurance that was resistant to the kind of damage that requires you to notice it, and so, in the useful sense, he was untroubled. Emmeline, to the best of my observation, did not waste further attention on him. She had not expected to be valued by him, and she had not been, and she had made her life accordingly, around the fact of it rather than against it. Now she had something better to organize herself around. She and Ashmore returned to Ashmore Park in August, as was the custom, and I went with them for a fortnight, the last of several long stays that year, each of which had been, in its way, the same story told in a quieter key. The estate was doing well. The east field was not flooding. The rebuilt barn was sound. The provisioner's account had been corrected and showed no new errors. The kitchen garden's south wall had been replanted on her recommendation and was, Drage informed me with proprietary satisfaction, already exceeding its previous yield. On the last evening before I was to depart, we sat in the garden after dinner, the 3 of us, with the late summer light still holding in the west and the sound of the garden in the evening quiet around us. Emmeline had a book open on her knee, unread. Ashmore had a glass of port. We were not talking, not because there was nothing to say, but because we had reached the point in the evening and in the year where nothing needed to be said. I looked at them. He was watching the west light. She was watching the garden. Between them on the bench, their hands lay together, not clasped, simply side by side, his large and still, her smaller and equally still, touching without need for demonstration. It was not a romantic gesture in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and more durable than that, the kind of contact that has been established as ordinary, as expected, as the arrangement of 2 people for whom proximity has become the default. I had known Ashmore for 31 years. I had known him through every season of his life, the difficult early years, the long bachelor decades of careful self-sufficiency, the period when I had half believed he had resolved to feel nothing except what he chose to feel, and had made his peace with the limits of that. I had not known, until this year, what he would look like when something found him. I had not known he was findable. He simply required the right person to do the finding. She had done it without announcement and without effort, the way she did everything, by being, simply and completely, herself, and having the patience to go on being herself in a house that had not yet learned to recognize what it was looking at. My daughter asked me, when I finished, whether I thought such things happened often, men like Ashmore, who had shut themselves away from feeling for so long, finding their way back to it through the particular accident of the right person in the same house. I told her I thought it happened more often than people admitted, because the shutting away and the finding were both things most people did quietly and without announcement, and the world does not, as a rule, take detailed notes on what goes on in the drawing rooms and gardens and libraries of its quieter inhabitants. What I thought but did not say was that it happened most reliably when the right person did not try to open the door, but simply went on existing with full integrity on the other side of it, until the man inside found himself curious about the sound of someone living so completely without requiring his attention. Emmeline had not tried to open any doors. She had simply been Emmeline Hartwell, entirely and without apology, in every room he gave her access to, and left it to him to discover what she was. He had discovered it. The discovery, as it turned out, was everything. The garden was quiet, the light was going. After a while she closed the book, and he refilled her glass without her asking, and she thanked him, and they sat on in the garden until the last of the light was gone, and I thought, this is what I will tell my daughter. Not that love arrives, everyone knows love can arrive. But that a woman who was called an acceptable arrangement became the only one he would ever have chosen, if all the choosing had been his from the first, and that he told her so in a room full of people who heard it, and it was the most inarguable thing I ever witnessed. He had built it in 3 movements. She had been counting. That is the whole of it.